I, as a member of the College of Security and Global Studies of the American University of the Emirates, and on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Global Economic Future, I'm glad to join you today. And we can initiate this session number one. Mr. Reed Blakemore, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Castaneda, and thanks to the CSGEF for having me today. And I'll be rather brief and circumspect in my remarks, mainly to do the job of hopefully teeing up my boss for a good set of comments on his own. But a few thoughts to build off of what Mahmoud was saying here. I think when we look at the broader market context today and how that's informing the producers within the MENA region. It's important to note that you really have three concurrent and in some ways compounding drivers within the market that are driving kind of the uncertainty and volatility that we've seen over the past several years and we're likely to see moving forward. The first of those is, as Mahmoud mentioned, this overarching period we're in of climate action and a policy-led transition away from fossil fuels, right? That policy momentum is going to continue to, build, right? And we've seen that over the course of consecutive COPs now. And I think importantly, that's creating a question around, an uncertain question around how robust is the change in hydrocarbons demand going to be over the next several decades, and importantly, how quickly will that change come to pass? That's causing any number of questions around the investment picture, right? What does the stranded asset picture look like out to 2030, 2040, and beyond? And I think we've seen over the past several years the questions around that investment potential actually bear strongly into the supply side. In terms of spare capacity availability as we move into a supply crisis as a result of one of these other exogenous factors. So to that end, I think there's two exogenous shocks that we need to contextualize that energy transition in now. One is the demand side shock that we saw as a result of COVID-19, much of which we're still actually seeing the tail end of currently. Right, you obviously have an extraordinary loss of demand, and that loss of demand is still being felt as we look to the possible return of Chinese demand as it winds down its zero COVID policy in 2023 out to 2024. So we're still seeing kind of the tail end of that demand side shock from COVID-19 play out through the market. The other piece there is the tail end of the economic recovery from COVID-19. Obviously, during COVID-19, you saw a huge amount of government stimulus that resulted in the inflationary environment that many central banks are trying to wind down currently. However, that's left us in this very interesting period where we have a really narrow runway to navigate, bringing down those inflation rates without inducing economic recession. So there's another sort of demand side headwind that you face as you as a result of what has really been a 3 and possibly a 4-year period of suffering through the effects of the pandemic. The second exogenous shock that's worth noting here is the supply side shock you see resulting from the war in Ukraine, right? Obviously, as a result of Russian barrels in an oil context being taken off the market, by Western prohibition. Also on the gas side, but also the development of a shadow market for those barrels as consumers in India and China look to buy out those barrels possibly at a discount. You've seen this kind of fracturing start to emerge. What's also increasingly apparent as a possible driver is, in addition to the fracturing, kind of the split between your theoretical and your actual Russian barrels that are emerging on the market, you do have a sense of what the lasting damage to the Russian oil production space might be. You have this declared 500,000 barrel per day production cut from Russia. To what extent is that voluntary or involuntary, possibly, as a result of some of those brownfields no longer necessarily being viable as Western technologies, in the service industry have left the country in response to sanctions. The last piece I'll mention in regards to the war in Ukraine that's really, really important to drive home here is the reprioritization of energy security and the interplay of that within the context of energy transition. The prioritization of energy security now driving this concept of the energy trilemma, how we balance energy security, affordability, and sustainability. and what that means for our energy policy and production moving forward. So turning to the MENA region now, right? What do these trends mean as far as, influencing production decisions in the oil and gas space? And I think you can divide that into a series of short-term and medium to long-term outlooks. First, in the short term, specifically as we look to oil, I think you've seen the kind of the wait and see approach that's been adopted by OPEC plus actually bear some fruit here, because you still have so much demand side uncertainty. You don't necessarily know how strongly that Chinese demand is going to come back to the market, nor exactly what the macroeconomic outlook is going to be like as we navigate the possibility of a recession stimulated by both central bank action as well as the possibility of just economic downturn as in Europe. So ultimately, when you have those kind of those demand side questions, right, and a lot of, I think, the market risk currently is contextualizing the downside of the demand. It's hard to fault necessarily OPEC Plus's strategy of kind of keeping the powder dry in one way or another. The other piece I think that's relevant here is in the short term as it relates to oil, is kind of the return of those energy security concerns, and whether or not those are actually, that's going to create an environment where producers should be considering a higher demand floor as countries look to recognize that they're going to have latent persistent oil demand in their economies and look for a range of diversified sources by which to realize that demand or supply that demand. I think when you contextualize that with long-term economic growth in Asia, the uncertainty around navigating oil balances in the United States and the broader West, there is this element of energy security is going to provide a tailwind to Western producers to continue to think through the role that they're going to play in supplying the broader oil market and what that means for issues around spare capacity and investment in spare capacity. A similar story is kind of what you'll see in the gas market, right? Where the decision by the Europeans, right, to move away from Russian gas is creating something of a supply side crisis as they look to both replace those Russian volumes at the same time they're also transitioning to, accelerating their transition to renewable baseload sources. So you have two features there that I think are really, really important. What happens to those Russian volumes, I think, remains in question, right? It's going to be much harder for Russia to find new consumers to send those cargoes to. The obvious destination there in some ways is China. However, the pipeline infrastructure to get those volumes to China is yet uncertain. So you might actually see some of those barrels not necessarily make it to market as quickly as you might otherwise expect. And that's also partially because I just don't think that Russia has the LNG markets available to it as it might otherwise think. The extent is a considerable amount of LNG markets available to it. What that means is kind of we're in this environment in the gas market right now where the need for additional supplies is actually rather sharp, at least in the short term. And so you're seeing, investment decisions that were kind of criticized previously. Like just a few years ago, we were kind of looking at several massive field expansions taken by the Qataris and saying what's going on there. That those are some ways countervailing the broader energy transition trends. But now those same expansions are absolutely critical. And the broader supply side stress we're seeing in the market right now is actually adding some momentum to what you would previously consider marginal economic, marginal projects. You'd look to, the fact that we're talking now about the possibility of engaging deeply in the Vaca Muerta in Argentina, despite considerable fiscal uncertainties there. The fact that Mozambique LNG, right, is now a major opportunity on the to fill some of those supply side gaps. I think is really are examples of a trend we're going to see in the market for the next several years. Over the long term, right, I think what we want to see is just one last point, I guess. I think it's still uncertain, how extensive or persistent the supply side stress will be, right? In a way, the West won the energy war, right, in 2023. How that plays out as it's refilling those inventories again, looking out to 2024 and possibly 2025, particularly contextualized by continued demand for coal to gas switching in Asia, in line with energy transition goals, is going to be a really important signpost as to how persistent those supply side signals are going to remain. Over the long term, I think it's going to be really interesting for Middle Eastern producers to think through the balance of the relationship between its production within an energy security context, but as that relates to broader energy transition. So that change is twofold, really. I think it's interesting to watch how the composition of demand unfolds. In which sectors is oil demand going to still be sticky? But also whether or not a premium slowly but surely is established on producers who can offer a lower carbon barrel of oil in response to policy expectations for energy transition, but also can provide a low cost barrel at the same time, right? As we see this broader market shift around investment to want to avoid stranded asset risk or avoid the severe consequences of stranded asset risk. And I think, but that speaks to particularly a second feature of the long-term oil market outlook, which is whether or not the supply side is equipped to handle that process of the transition, right? We've seen really an absence of strong investment in the upstream, and we're bearing the consequences of that currently, Landon said in numerous occasions that, the core feature in some ways of the energy system right now is that we're short energy, right? And that's a direct consequence of some of the absent investment decisions that we saw dating back to 2014. But I also think that applies equally to the refining complex, right? And as we think about the goods and products that we are going to need in an energy transition, whether or not sufficient investments have been made across the refining system and in the midstream to provide those to accommodate the crudes that are going to be necessary to produce those products, but also create sufficient quantities of those products in the first place. Over the long term for gas, I think that we're looking at the conversation around gas as a long-term source of baseload power supply has largely been settled somewhat. Europe's going to continue to accelerate towards and likely reach its goal of predominantly hydrocarbons-free power generation over the long term. But I think its ability now to reverse course on these narratives in relation to the developing world's needs and ambitions to see coal to gas switching and have available baseload security from gas supplies is rather limited. And I think we saw this take place or unfold at COP27, where the needs of the developing world around sustainable economic development, the role of natural gas in that sustainable economic development story really was brought to the table, and it was incredibly difficult for the Europeans and the West writ large to refute that. And I think that's a lasting change we're going to see over the next coming years. Moving to a couple more points, because I realize I'm taking up a good chunk of time right now. I think looking forward, as we look to kind of the broader geopolitical macroeconomic factors that are going to be driving the oil and gas space, I think we're most certainly looking at a fractured market. I think the reality of this period in the oil market in particular creating an east-west divide, where due to Russia's lack of trust now from the West as a reliable energy provider, but also the West's behavior in terms of using sanctions as a way to create demand side schisms and craft its own value chains in the hydrocarbons market is an important outcome of this period that's going to last for some time. But I think most importantly, what we're going to see actually is how this new moment of energy security and energy geopolitics creates new folds in known existing geopolitical fault lines out there. How does this new moment in energy geopolitics relate to the possibility of a cross-straits crisis between China and Taiwan? How does this new geopolitical moment in energy markets relate to the possible deterioration of nuclear negotiations between the P5+1 and Iran? I think those geopolitical features are going to change and those geopolitical risks out there are going to have new impacts on the energy market as this kind of post-Russia-Ukraine war settles in. The last thing I'll say is kind of, that I was asked to address is what opportunities and challenges might present themselves to the MENA region as a result of this period. I think, certainly in the short term, the region's importance as a valuable player in the broader energy security paradigm couldn't be clearer, right? The region's resources are at center stage in a conversation around how to manage energy security at the same time we're managing the climate challenge. And I think that's perhaps the biggest opportunity for the region at this moment. If it can effectively establish itself as a resource for energy security solutions that can contribute to net zero pathways, hitting that sweet spot is going to position the region strongly over the next several decades. There's two really important pieces to this. One is, first off, taking advantage of the opportunity presented by COP28 this coming November, December, right? This is the fact that the COP is being hosted by a major oil and gas producer at this particular moment in energy markets is hugely important and of long-term significance if the oil and gas industry chooses to take advantage of the moment. It's either going to be a catalyst for success or possibly to the downside, an irrecoverable disappointment if the oil and gas industry doesn't come to the table to make its case for contributing to the broader net zero story. The second piece related to that is how the region is positioning itself for these shifts that are likely to take place, particularly in the global oil market in relation to the future composition of oil demand. I think we've seen the UAE and Saudi Arabia begin to position themselves in this way to establish themselves as the producers that are going to sell. If it's the last oil cargo, it's the last lowest cost and lowest carbon cargo, in the market. That's an extreme example in some ways, but that strategy underpinning that example, I think, is going to position the region well in the future. And I'll stop there. I think there's a few broader trends that we can begin to talk about further, but I think that should give us enough to chew on, hopefully.